All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Forms class. Sorry, a little delayed with the fire alarm testing. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and get right to it. Today, we are doing all of the forms that you probably never have heard of before. These are the 90 series. Type this. All right, so there's a saying that I've said a million times in Forms class, but it's still true to this day, and that is that there's a form for that. There's a form for pretty much every single thing you need. The attorneys have gotten together and drafted carefully to make sure that we have every single thing we need to complete transactions. This includes a bunch of these forms, which you're going to see today. A lot of brokers get in the habit of drafting because they don't know that these forms exist. And obviously when you draft, that's where you're bringing on probably the greatest risk in any transaction. So first things first is we're going to look at the blank notice. Now, something that typically we always train from in forms class is always the manual, right? So on the left-hand side is always the link to the form itself. The right-hand side is always the link to the manual that explains the forms in greater detail. Well, all of these do not have manuals except for a couple of them. And it's kind of funny, but the forms themselves are very self-explanatory and usually very simple. So we're going to start out by going to the first form, which is the blank notice. Blank notices get used very rarely. Sometimes you need to give notice of approval of things, that sometimes you want to give notice that it's an approval. What do you guys recognize on this notice that is different than most of our other forms? Here, let me shrink it down so you can kind of see.
The signature.
The signature?
Where's that with that? It just says date, but is there a signature? Are you supposed to sign on that?
Those are those are signature lines, but who signs? What is it? Who would sign?
Everyone.
Mm-hmm. What's very different about this notice is that it's one-sided. There's not two parties to this addendum, right? So literally, if you're giving notice of approval of something, that, hey, this is the notice of an approval, or maybe it's a notice of a disapproval. Most of the time, disapprovals have their own form. You will, like I said, you will rarely use this, but it can be done. Trying to think of that. Now there is a couple of forms where they used to state that you could give notice of approval in like the walkthrough, right? Your 5 day prior to closing walkthrough. I've seen some brokers use the notice of approving it. Do you have to do that? No, you don't have to. It's not necessary. I don't think it's like one of those things that I would probably train, you guys to do this. It's just some of the things I've seen this form used by. So it's going to be rare. Let's jump into the next one. So 90A, notice of rescission of agreement pursuant to Form 17. So how many days do you have to review the Form 17? 3. Yep. From when?
Preceded self-disclosure.
From receipt, not mutual acceptance. That's a big one that catches a lot of brokers with their hands in the cookie jar. They think it's like, pretty much every single thing in our contracts, the timelines usually begin upon mutual acceptance. This is definitely one of the ones that it is from receipt. So whenever you receive the Form 17, you absolutely could be receiving the Form 17 before mutual. I know some old school brokers who still to this day, they refuse to upload the seller disclosure statement into the supplements because they want proof to send it to them so they can, so they can send it to the buyer broker so they know when their timelines begin. Has anyone heard, have you heard of that before? Have you heard of that?
We always upload it.
Yeah, I think it's best practice to have it uploaded. Why waste time?
And then we ask them to waive it
Yeah.
or to, I mean, they usually include it with their offer.
Mm-hmm.
Seller acknowledges receipt of that.
Yep. So if your buyer was going to terminate the agreement based on the Form 17, there's a couple things that has to be still in play. Get up to the Form 17. Whoop. Let's go Control F and we'll put 3. Okay. 32 times it says 3. That would be 3. Oh yeah, it's gonna do each line then. It's gotta be 3. Oh, how about terminate? Oh, there it is. Oh, because it's in a parentheses, it couldn't find it, or maybe it would have. Buyer shall have 3 days from the day seller or seller's agent delivers this disclosure statement to rescind the agreement by delivering a separately signed written statement of rescission to seller or seller's agent. You may waive the right to rescind prior to or after the time you enter into a sale contract. So if your buyer signed on line 292, acknowledging receipt only, then this is still preserved. Okay. And if your buyer is like, had no inspection contingency at all, and they waived everything else was all waived, no contingencies at all, but you still had this seller disclosure statement, right? And let's say you got it on the day that you had mutual, so you received it. In 3 business days, you can send the 90A. And then you can go ahead and mark buyers review the seller's disclosure statement, Form 17 or 17C or 17 commercial, whichever is applicable, and elects to rescind the agreement. Buyer hereby demands return of the earnest money. So if earnest money was deposited, what other form would go with this?
Release of earnest money and the 98. Or wait, no, that is, never mind.
So you need this form and a 50. Remember when we went over just a few weeks ago, we did the 50 and the 51? That's when, you know, whenever our contracts say there's language in it that tells you what will happen to earnest money in the event of the party rescinding. Right? So right here it says 3 days from the date sellers delivers the disclosure statement to rescind the agreement by delivering separately signed seller's agent, you may waive the right to rescind. So if the earnest money's been deposited, you're going to be using the 50 with it. So it's always the 2 forms because you have a right to rescind. That's pretty much the golden rule. If you know that the buyer has a right to get out of the deal and they're protected, then you know you're going to be needing 2 forms instead of just the 1. The 51 is that's straight up rescission, reset to back before you even had an agreement. And that is usually used in ways of no legal excuse to terminate. So that's probably the best way to remember how to use this one. All right, let's jump to any questions before we jump from the 90A to the next one? No, all right. Who knew that form existed? Who knew about the 90A? Did anybody know about that one before? Never seen it. All right, 90B. Notice the termination of agreement for failure to pay earnest money. This is a big one. If you've been listening to Annie Fitzsimmons' weekly videos, she she has the Department of Licensing right now in a weekly video update and going over auditing. And just last one, probably gonna make it a class next month to literally probably watch it, because it's the number one thing in an audit that people get caught with, is the earnest money. It's, there's a process for earnest money. If it's not delivered and to the escrow on time, then there must be documentation done. And also we have to show proof in not only our file, but the other firm's file. So both firms must have multiple items. First, it's if either party touched that client's earnest money, you have to provide a receipt. Form 89, no matter what. And that receipt has to be in both firms. The second part is if earnest money is late. And you guys all decide on when should earnest money be deposited. What's a good day for earnest money? How many days on front of our contracts? How many? 3 days. That's probably still the best to put on there. If you have less than that, you're probably risking your clients being late, and then the seller has a right to terminate on you. People do wires all the time, and wires have cutoff times for going out, and escrow has cutoff times for being received. So if you cannot give good timelines, you might be screwing your client right from the very beginning of the deal. So the second thing is, if you're going to be late, we have to show proof that all parties were notified. Whose job do you think it is, first and foremost, that should make sure and follow up that the deposit has been made? Whose job?
Buyer's agent first, and then the listing agent double checks, right?
I mean, realistically, I would say the listing agent has more of a duty in that situation to make certain that it's been done. Why? I kind of already gave you the answer.
They're in breach and we could terminate. If there's another offer on the table, we could.
Because the buyer's in breach of the agreement, and our seller has a right to go ahead and terminate on them immediately. They can immediately terminate. If we don't show proof in our firm's file, which is SkySlope, and how do you do this? You have to be able to send an email. Send an email notification, and you're going to send it to all parties of the contract. It's the authorized firm email addresses. It is the listing broker, going to the buyer broker. It is, I would send it to the DBs too. You send it that and sell it to your client. So if it's the seller, you gotta notify the seller. That email has to be included into your SkySlope. You just add it into the documents, it doesn't have to go into the checklist, but it has to show proof that both firms get a copy of that and get that email. Our last 2 audits that we had, both times we got hit with that. Earnest money was late and we didn't have notice proof, both times. And that's in the video. That's what Annie said is when she was talking with the Department of Licensing, the auditors said the number one thing that they always find is this. So we got to be better about it. So if your seller does want to terminate, now, sometimes sellers are fine and they're going to go, you know what, we're going to move forward anyway. We're okay. Do an addendum, do a form 34 and just put, for clarification purposes, the earnest money deposit date shall be whatever day now, change it to a new date. And then both parties can sign and then you can move forward. The worst thing you can do possible is not say anything at all. I have heard of a very strong real estate attorney in our area that reviewed a file, and the story goes like this. He went through and he, was like, okay, let's review this deal. Okay, yeah, this is bad. Okay, let me look. He's reviewing the deal, and then he comes to the earnest money because he goes through the whole contract. I mean, the whole thing. And he's like, oh, look at the receipt from earnest money. It was 3 days late. Why was earnest money late? You're the seller. Did your listing broker notify you that you could have terminated on these guys? So it turned into a whole thing of this person going to get legal advice first against the buyer broker and the buyer and the whole other, their whole deal. But then it turned into them going after their own listing broker because they never notified them. They could have fired that client in the very beginning instead of being dragged through the mud for 90 days and, stuck on this deal. And here they never closed. So by you not doing your duty, you literally can be in trouble too. And the seller needs to be notified of it. So even if they're going to move forward, you got to have the proof. And here is the proof, or excuse me, here's the addendum in the event that the seller wants to terminate. There's no other signatures on the line again, right? So it's just the seller. Goodbye. They can completely terminate. All right. Time for 90C. Here's a failure to close notice of termination by buyer. Failure to close notice of termination by buyer. Closing has failed to occur by the closing date through no fault of buyer. Therefore, buyer elects to terminate the agreement and demands return of the earnest money. What type of situation do you think you'd have to use this for? You think?
We just had an instance where Moose was selling one of his personal properties and the electricity was like wonky. And so the city repairs kind of like put us back. Could that be?
Yeah, that's exactly probably the situation, is where the seller has delayed the deal. Buyer's done everything possible that they could. And the seller's just like, you're not performing, seller. I'm not going to extend again when you're not even, the last time that I had to help someone use this, the situation was they went to the property 4 days before closing for their prior to closing walkthrough, and nothing was packed. Not a single item. And the garage was just filled with like tools and like just all sorts of crap. And they're like, no way, I'm not gonna close. And the person was like very difficult to deal with. So they went all the way through the end of the transaction. I just said, well, hold steady to show that you've done all performance. Docs came to escrow. And you can't go sign, you can sign, they signed them, but they said strict instructions to escrow, do not release and record until we give final notification, because the seller hasn't moved. And we had a possession on closing in our contract. And they ended up using this. And the Form 50, get the earnest money back. So it's not always like buyers, right? We hear a lot of time, oh, it's the buyer's fault, mostly the buyer's fault. But nope, there can be times when the seller's difficult too and things happen. So the 90C would be used for that type of situation. There's just failure to close. All right, 90D, failure to close notice of termination by seller. Sellers keep earnest money. Okay. Failure to close, notice of termination by seller. Seller to keep earnest money. The transaction contemplated by the agreement has failed to close by the closing date through no fault of seller. Therefore, seller hereby elects to terminate the agreement and shall be entitled to retain the earnest money as seller's sole remedy. This one is very hard to use. Because escrow needs signatures from all parties to release the earnest money. And that's the thing we try to remind you guys, even if all parties are, your party's totally correct and they follow the contract to a T, the other party can argue anything. They could say, no, I'm not signing that. And then you'd have to interplead for their earnest money, even if the buyer had 100% rights out of the deal. Years ago, we had in this office, we had a deal where the seller was like pre-foreclosure and they were, it was like a hoarder situation. Buyer, wanted to buy the house, but the seller just wasn't cooperating, didn't let the appraiser in, wanted the lockbox removed. They ended up taking the lock or the whole handle off and took the lockbox off and threw it on the ground and basically put a new lock on it and like, nope, no one's coming in my house. I don't care. And then they're like, well, we're terminating on the inspection contingency then. So we're gonna walk. Seller never responded, would not sign the 50 to get the buyer's earnest money back, even though the buyer had 100% a right to terminate the agreement. So situations can happen. And it took over 3.5 months for them to get the money back, and it cost them the $750. So they lost money of it. So things can happen. This one will be very hard to get pushed through, but it is possible. All right, 90E, failure to close notice of termination by seller to elect remedies. This is the situation where on the Form 21, that our clients or somehow client, instead of marking the box of forfeiture of earnest money for an election of remedy or the election of remedies box, they chose the election of remedies, which is absolutely insane. If you're representing a buyer, you're always marking that box for the release of earnest money in the event of default. You're just not going to do the other one. Failure to close, notice of termination by seller to elect remedies. The transaction contemplated by the agreement has failed to close by the closing date through no fault of seller. Therefore, seller hereby elects to terminate the agreement and shall be entitled to remedies as provided for in the agreement. That one is literally, what are the remedies? What are the remedies?
Seller could write $10,000 or whatever, and whatever they.
Well, it's loss of earnest money, but it's probably going to be too, like maybe sue for specific performance or sue for damages. Hey, I moved across the country. I emptied my house. You can't close. I'm not only retaining your earnest money, but I'm suing you for all the costs of my move, for the cost of having to make 2 more mortgage payments, suffering damages. Yeah, you owe me $80,000 now, buyer. And here's my attorney. It could be anything. So it's very, very critical that you guys, when you write deals, that you're always marking that forfeiture of earnest money box. Always. I literally reviewed a deal with someone for our listing, and the buyer broker marked that election of remedies. I was like, whoa, okay. I don't know why. All right, next we've got. All right, so notice for Form 22EF, evidence of funds. We got a couple different ones on this one. So here's seller's notice of termination. Buyer failed to timely provide evidence of non-contingent funds as required by paragraph 2 of the evidence of funds addendum to purchase and sale agreement, Form 22EF. Accordingly, seller elects to terminate the agreement, instructs the party holding the earnest money to disperse the earnest money to buyer. So seller can just totally terminate because the buyer didn't show the proof of funds on time. Or here's the next one. Buyer failed to timely provide evidence of contingent funds as required by paragraph 3 of the evidence of funds addendum to purchase and sale agreement, Form 22EF. Accordingly, seller elects to terminate the agreement and instructs the party holding the earnest money to disperse the earnest money to buyer. So it's a way for the seller to get out of the deal. We actually used this one a little while back. so that our seller can take a much better offer. I helped a broker from Bellevue do this. And it got their seller like $70,000 or $80,000 more money. And the buyer was pissed. They were pissed because they were like, they didn't do anything wrong, but their buyer broker did something actually very wrong. And this mistake actually happens a lot with the 22 EF, evidence of funds.
What was the difference on that one between those two options? Paragraph one,
One was
paragraph two.
contingent. one-
Here, I'll show you. Yeah,
Okay.
you'll see here in a second. So the first box that we just went over was for this one. It's for evidence of non-contingent funds. See, the default for this one is 3 days, right? From mutual, you got to provide it. If they don't provide it, now our seller gets notice, hey, they didn't provide it on time, we can terminate. And that's what we would use. We'd use that 90 EF. But then this is the box that the second one is for. It's the disclosure of contingent funds. What's the difference between this one and the other one for how many days? 3 versus 10 days. Okay, when do the funds from a loan typically get to escrow?
the foreclosure closing day.
On closing day, typically on closing day. So their broker left this at default. It was due 10 days before closing. So whenever you're writing a 22 EF and you are using the box 3, or you have to marking anything in 3, you want to make sure this is a 0 in here. You want it 0 days before closing. Otherwise, you're giving a right to that seller to terminate. That's how we got our seller more money. That we just knew the forms better. So that's what it comes down to. Transactional excellence is something that obviously we take very seriously here, but it is completely can make the entire difference for you and your business. I mean, knowing something like that to get your seller more money is what the name of the game is. All right, questions? Before we jump to the next one. All right, back to the 90s. Next is the 90 FERPTA, buyer's FERPTA notice. And this one's a multiple choice one. The following notices are for use for the seller's citizenship and foreign investment in real property tax act, FERPTA, provision in the purchase and sale agreement. Buyer's right to terminate notice. Buyer hereby gives notice that seller failed to timely provide FERPTA certification to the closing agent. Buyer may terminate this agreement anytime 3 days after delivery of this notice if seller does not earlier provide the FERPTA certification to the closing agent. So it's basically, if you still don't get that FERPTA form, if you're representing the buyer, it is your job to make sure the FERPTA is actually provided to your client. It's not just the form 21 on the front page. Is seller a foreign person? Yes, no. It's not, that is not this form. This, the 22E FERPTA must be provided. You got to have it in every deal. And it's our job to get it, not escrows. And then if they don't do it, there's also this one. Buyer's notice of termination. Seller failed to timely provide FERPTA certification to the closing agent. Buyer gave notice to seller that if seller did not provide the FERPTA certification to closing agent, buyer may terminate this agreement anytime 3 days after delivery of that notice. Seller failed to provide the FERPTA certification to closing agent, and therefore buyer hereby gives notice that buyer elects to terminate the agreement and demands the return of the earnest money. So you would use this 90 FERPTA and a form 50, and you buyer could walk. So it's rare, but this one definitely could be used too. Only thing different about this one is that this is the notice, and then the second use would be the terminate. So you have to do both. All right, time for 90H. Here's buyer's notice of waiver of financing contingency. Okay, buyer's notice of waiver of financing contingency. Buyer hereby gives notice that buyer waives the financing contingency set forth in the financing addendum. So if the buyer wanted to waive the financing contingency, you can go ahead and do that with this form. Most of the time, I think in, pretty much normal circumstances, you're gonna see the 22AR come over from the listing broker side for the seller to give notice to perform. That means that the buyer's utilizing option A in the form 22A, not option B. Option B is an automated notice or termination on a timeline. So whatever date you put in there, it automatically terminates on that date with option B. Don't forget, option A goes on forever. It's infinity, even if you put 1 day in that box until the notice to perform is signed and waived. So the seller has to initiate that. If you're the listing broker and you get a deal and you're representing the seller and on the 22A, they've marked option A, that means you have to have dialogue with your seller every single time. Questions about that? You guys send those, huh? Yeah.
You sent out the notice.
Yeah. How many times do you have issues with they're not signed?
Not that I
Something?
know of.
No. All right, 90I. Buyer's notice of termination, financing unavailable. So in the event your buyer doesn't qualify and the lender says, yep, there's no way we can get them approved, you will be using this form, the 90I, buyer's notice of termination, financing unavailable. Buyer's notice of termination, financing unavailable. Buyer hereby elects to give notice that after a good faith effort, buyer is unable to obtain financing, and buyer hereby elects to terminate the agreement and demands the return of earnest money. Okay, when this situation happens, you need to pull up the 22A. When this happens, be prepared. Good listing brokers are going to require 3 items in order to be able to still release that earnest money. And okay, so notice of termination. If this happens, okay, if buyer has not previously waived the financing contingency, seller may give notice of termination of this agreement anytime 3 days after delivery. That's the 22AR like we talked about. Let's go to the next spot, to earnest money. This is the part that connects to the 90I. If buyer has not waived the financing contingency and is unable to obtain financing by closing after a good faith effort, you have to hang on to this one. Then on buyer's notice, this agreement shall terminate. The earnest money shall be refunded to buyer after lender confirms in writing. We have 3 items that must be provided, and you might as well make sure you're going to have those up front. So first thing is item A is the date buyer's loan application for the property was made, including a copy of the loan estimate that was provided to buyer. So those are that's the first thing that is needed, right? It's actually kind of 2 things. You got to show proof that buyer made the loan application on time, which is how many days defaulted? 5 days. 5 days. The second thing, you got to get a copy of the loan estimate that was provided to buyer. So that's the first piece that you need. Second thing, that buyer possessed sufficient non-contingent funds to close. Example, the down payment, closing costs, etc. So you got to have evidence or proof. You got to be able to show proof buyer had sufficient funds, or the very best thing to do is in that denial letter from the lender, which is the next thing here, is that you would state the items that buyer made the loan application on time, buyer was unable to get the loan for a specific reason, but buyer did have sufficient funds. So if you can get the lender, a good lender can get all three of those elements on one letter and provide that copy of the loan estimate that was provided to the buyer. So if you get those two things, typically we don't have any pushback from the other party, but sometimes you still may. It just depends on how the transaction was going. So C is the reasons that buyer was unable to obtain financing by closing. If seller terminates this agreement, the earnest money shall be refunded without need for such confirmation. So if a seller's like terminating on you because of the 22 AR, you don't have to give those reasons, stuff like that. Let me give you guys a little pop quiz because I haven't had you guys read much today. You guys see if you can get this one. It's difficult, but maybe you can. All right, so your buyer has made the loan application on time. They made it in 3 days, so they've already done their loan app. And they have done everything right. But the lender says, hey, I can't do this loan. You're not gonna, I can't approve it. We're not gonna approve you. We're denying the loan. Can that buyer, once he's denied, go to a different lender without the seller's permission?
It would depend if they're in their timeline of notice, right? Isn't that on 22A?
What do you guys think? Let's just go around. Hannah, so you say no, you say yes. What do you think there? I know you're very new to that and stuff, and you could,
I would say no.
okay, you don't know. Ella, you're saying no too?
Forget why, but I know it's.
You forget why, but you know it's
I
not.
know we talked about it
Feels like
before.
that you should.
It feels like you shouldn't. What do you think?
I think buyer needs to like at least communicate that they're gonna do that like this. Or
Yeah.
get some, I think there's some sort of community. I don't know if it's an actual permission. It's probably. permission.
Yeah, I feel like it's a yes, like a hard.
I forget what it is that.
Feeling
you
good,
can't.
feeling good about it.
You're feeling good on the,
Yeah.
so the whole room is no. Hannah,
So confident.
Like,
and we got one don't know. Zoom people? Huh?
killing me. It's been-
Okay, all right. I highlighted this before we started reading it, but if buyer has not waived the financing contingency, okay, there's the first portion of this thing, and is unable to obtain financing by closing after a good faith effort. What's a good faith effort?
Go into another lender. You can't get it, right?
That means you got to do everything you can to get the loan, right? You've done everything. You've exhausted. So the answer is yes. They actually. Now listen, there's some things to this, but listen. They can go to another lender even without permission, okay? But you're gonna have a much smoother transaction communicating on what's going on. But the buyer does not automatically waive the financing contingency for doing that in that situation. But there's you gotta have some elements, you gotta have pieces of proof to make sure that you're doing everything you can to get the loan still. So if the lender can't do it, and they're like, hey, I know another lender who can, and they can do the exact same, stuff, but they can get them approved. You can switch without proof, and that does not constitute a waiver. However, if you are switching the loan type, like, oh, the buyer, you wrote this deal and it was FHA, and now they're like, you know what? I'm gonna switch it from FHA to conventional, and there's a conventional 3% down. That's a different loan type. And you would have to get the 22 AC signed in that type of a situation like normal. Otherwise, you could constitute waiver. I'm gonna ask Annie next time I talk with her about that situation. Like, can a buyer completely change their loan and their down payment? Is that constitute a good faith, or is that fall under the lines of, not? Like, or is the buyer in breach at that point because the loan
might
is
be what else.
completely different? So you're probably thinking along those
Yeah,
lines.
yeah.
And probably some of you too, thinking the same thing, but that is the truth, that they could do that, but always, always, always communicate it of what's going on. And you're gonna have better outcome usually.
So it's like just applying with one lender, not considered a good faith effort. So what if they apply with one lender and they're like, yeah, no matter where you go, it's not gonna work, like you.
Well, buyer has, they gotta make their loan application within 5 days, and whatever you fill in. Right, whatever you fill in on this form. Then. You've got to follow with what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
With what you put in here, so,
Let's say they like bought a car with like $1,000 payment and it's like, okay, yeah, you can go to any bank.
and it's no one's gonna
You're
get you
not gonna
that.
afford this anywhere close to
Who
this price.
decides what a good faith effort is?
Right, like,
That's-
at that point, it wouldn't really matter what lender you go to, you just screwed yourself by taking
Yeah.
$1,000 out of your monthly. budget.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I literally had a deal die. I don't know how long ago this was, probably like 18, 19 years ago or longer. Like, the days of before closing, the lender's gotta pull
Right.
credit and checks and
Payment shop.
they literally both bought brand new cars. Two matching cars, his and her convertibles, VA buyers. Yeah, they were like, oh, we thought it would be fine. The salesman said they won't even show up on our credit until next week and blah, blah, blah. They bought two new convertibles, his and hers. They thought, oh yeah, it's gonna fit right in the garage. Like, no, you don't even have a house now. No one can approve you.
Yeah.
Literally the deal, yeah. And the seller wants your earnest money too.
Right.
Now you're gonna lose that.
It's got your buying power.
Yeah.
Like, wow.
So things happen, right? But. Yeah, buyer can do that. So, all right, let's continue. Back to the 90s. All right, 90K, buyer's contingency property notice. This is definitely something that gets used. All right, buyer's property sold, contingency satisfied. This goes along with what the 22B says you're gonna utilize, right? Buyers accepted an offer to sell buyer's property that is not contingent on the sale or closing of another property. And that will close no less than 30 days and no more than 45 days from the date buyer accepts the offer or is otherwise consented to by seller and seller's consent. Contingent sale form 90L or similar. For this notice to be effective, buyer must attach a copy of the complete purchase and sale agreement for the sale of buyer's property. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close, buyer must give notice to seller within 2 days as required by the buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B. And the next box that could be used is buyer's property not sold, but contingency waived. Buyer's not accepted an offer to sell buyer's property. However, buyer waives the contingency and buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B. Buyer understands that by waiving this contingency, buyer waives all other contingencies in the agreement, including financing, inspection, appraisal, anything under the sun, form 17, FERPTA, anything. If you end up like writing 22B in your contingent and they're gonna go ahead and just waive the contingency without the home sold, they gotta buy the house no matter what. So I have a story for you guys for this one. Whenever you're doing 22B, there's a couple elements you as listing brokers want to make certain. First is if the buyer's, not listing the property on time, they're all also going to automatically waive it. But there's a couple things you want to always make certain of. And let me tell you a story on a true story that happened to a very seasoned builder listing broker. Her family is a building company, very predominant Northwest company that's still around to this day. They had a new construction home, and this is back in like 2010. No, about 2012. About a $600,000 house. back then, that's pretty, that house now is over $1 million, easily. And, there was a contingent buyer came along and they said, yep, we love your home, we wanna buy it. We're gonna offer a little less and we want closing costs. And it had been slow, so they said, yep, we're gonna go ahead and take it. Earnest money was, because the buyers had a lot of stuff tied up at the time, they said, hey, we need to have earnest money a little lower than normal. We're gonna have it for $1,000. Okay? And the bump period was 3 days. Well, the sale on the buyer's home wasn't going too good. There wasn't anybody trying to buy their house. And they knew that wasn't going well. Well, a new buyer comes along and says, I'll give you full price. And they write it up and they want to bump that first buyer. So there's no closing costs, full price. Who's gonna get our listing broker seller a lot more money. And it was a quicker close because the other one, they're not contingent. So they gave the notice. They gave the form notice to the 90L to the buyer and said, here's your bump notice and you've got your 3 days to waive or terminate, which they were like, oh yeah, they're gonna terminate because they haven't sold their house yet and they can't move forward. We know from their lender. So we got this one, don't worry, guys. What do you think happened?
Waived and stuff.
Yeah, buyer waived it on the first day, sent it back, say, yeah, we're fine, we're gonna waive it. And I was working like, they can't do that, we know they can't sell, they're not gonna make it. What are they risking?
$1,000.
$1,000. That was it. So that was one lesson that our listing broker really learned is like, if you're accepting a contingent deal, you really better make certain that they can sell that house. Like, do your own CMA. See, like, what do you think it's worth? What are you gonna list it at? Oh, you're gonna list it for 80,000 over market pricing right now? And you want me to like wait around? No. Next is the bump period. What's the default for bump notices? Do you guys remember? Anybody?
5.
It's 5. It's 5 days. Bump period is when a seller can get another offer from somebody else, and that means they can tell that first buyer they got 5 business days to figure out what they want to do. Do they want to waive? Do they want to back out, get their earnest money back since their house isn't under contract yet? So 5 days is way too long. So realistically, I would put 1 or 2 days on that. Because think about it, if you're representing the seller, you do not want long days. I think the worst one I ever saw, someone wrote in there and we were like, why would you do this ever to a seller? They put 30 days. Can anybody think of why would someone put 30 days for a bump notice? And the listing broker would accept that. Why would they ever accept something like that? Can anyone think?
They the buyer.
No. Close.
Family member was a buyer.
No.
Interest.
If they're the listing broker, what else? Huh?
Commission?
Oh, they were double ending it.
Yes, they were the buyer broker too. Would you ever do that to a seller?
Sounds like a lawsuit.
Yeah.
Not the best.
Yeah, we
interest of
actually
seller.
argued it and stuff when he told us that. I go, wow, that sounds like a lawsuit. Does your seller fully understand that they can't take any better offer? And then he ended up getting them to terminate and we got the deal. So you never want a long period for bump, you representing the seller. And the other thing, just like why I told you that story, earnest money needs to be substantial. If it's not gonna sting for them to go away in those situations, don't accept anything low.
So in that situation, like say you're representing buyer.
Mhm.
But you're listing their house, and you're trying to get them into somewhere else, like, what is that timeline like? Like, how do you set that up? Like, I'm representing the buyer, but I'm listing their house, and they need that to sell to get into their new house.
Like, how quick do you want to? Like, are you talking about to get mutual and then get their house listed and
Yeah, like,
everything?
how
And
long is the timeline? Like, how long is an agreeable timeline? Like, hey, their house is listed. I don't know when it's.
45 days, I mean, is what I think defaulted, so you kind of, I mean, if you can get that long for your contingency. You know, yeah, that's okay, that's the, I think, default for, to get a deal under contract.
Gotcha.
But I don't know, the listing broker might say, I don't want you taking that long.
Right, right.
All right. Buyer's property failure to close. Let's go around the room since I've been reading the whole time. Start out with Gab.
Failure to close and reinstatement. Buyer hereby gives notice that the sale of buyer's property has failed to close or will fail to close. The contingency in buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B is reinstated until the contingency period expires.
All right, time out for 1 sec. So what they're talking about is in the 22B, if you had the 45 days and all of a sudden like day 20. Their house sale falls through, the buyer backs out, they lose their financing, lose their job, whatever, right? So now we gotta notify the seller and say, oh, yep, our buyers, you know, the house that they were selling in order to move forward is died. We need to get, you know, we need to get them, we'll get the contingency back and, you know, started again. So if they only had used up 20, they still got 25 days to get it under contract again.
But there's probably a form to restart that timeline.
This is it. Yeah, that's it right there. So go for it. Next one.
Failure to close and termination. Buyer hereby gives notice that the sale of buyer's property has failed to close or will fail to close. This agreement is terminated and earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer.
Yep. So here's the notice that the sale buyer's property has failed to close or will close. The agreement is terminated. The earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. So this is where you're over your 45 days. You know, you're past that date. Now you got no more time left. And that's to basically proper to give notice to terminate. So you would actually use this 90K, marking that box and a form 50 to get their earnest money back.
Failure to close and contingency waived. Buyer hereby gives notice that the sale of buyer's property has failed to close or will fail to close. However, buyer waives the contingency and buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B. Buyer understands that by waiving this contingency, buyer waives all other contingencies in the agreement, including financing, inspection, etc.
Yeah, so this is the situation where all of a sudden the buyer's contingent home sale falls through, but they're still gonna move forward. They got financing, they figured out a way to basically still buy the home without the contingent sale. So you would give this notice, but it is dangerous because once you're staying in the deal and that contingent property, you know, sale contingency goes away, you've got no more protections at all. And I have seen one of those deals happen where they waived it, they waived everything else, and then the appraisal came back low. So now then the buyer's not protected from a low appraisal even. So so they had to come up with another like 15 or 18,000 bucks in order to actually make the deal close. I think they got gift funds or something like that and made it work, and the deal still closed, but you might be in a weird situation like that. All right, so now we got a seller's notice to buyer. Let's see, Ella, you want to do that one?
Seller's notice of termination due to unapproved sale. Buyer accepted an offer for the sale of buyer's property without seller's prior written consent as required under paragraph 2 of form 22B that is contingent on the sale or closing of that second buyer's property or as a closing date less than 30 or more than 45 days from the date of mutual acceptance. Buyer is in default and seller hereby terminates the agreement and is entitled to remedies as provided.
What are they saying here?
So buyers in contract, they can't accept a similar offer to where the second buyers are contingent on their sale to get this one.
Correct.
This sale is contingent on this sale. You can't have two.
You can't have it unless you get permission. And same, not just that type of scenario, but the other one is closing before 30 days or closing after 45 days. You also have to have that seller's permission to accept a contract that is in that scenario too. You guys have, there'll be times and it's hard to catch. You seasoned brokers can get stung with this one, definitely. Cause it's hard to calculate and think about the closings and stuff like that. What's worse is you could actually have contracts that go out and you're waiting for mutual acceptance to get it on that day because closing will be, on this closing date will be because of that delay in a signing. All of a sudden, now the closing date, like if they would have got mutual, let's say today, closing would be exactly in 30 days, but since they had till tomorrow, the offer was still good till tomorrow, they signed it and sent it tomorrow. Now, how many days is that closing date away?
It's still 30 days, but it goes
It's
over.
29.
It's 29. Your closing date just dropped away one day. Is 29 earlier than 30 days?
Yeah.
Who needs permission? Who's got to grant permission on that?
Seller.
Seller or now the seller can do this. Now they can say, you're in breach, buyer. You just accepted a deal on your house, 29 days closing date. Nope. I needed to bless that offer before you accepted it. What's worse is that now the seller can say, well, we're terminated, and I get default, so you're in default, so I can get to keep your earnest money too. That's really bad. This one is a tough one. You gotta be so careful. So careful. Realistically, the first thing you should do in the situation when you're the buyer broker is look at that date on how long they have to accept that offer. If it's falling in any timeline that's gonna close the gap and put you in default, you're gonna have to figure out some way to say, okay, we have to get mutual on this date today, or if we don't, we're gonna be in breach. You gotta look at the timelines. This one is definitely a one that can get you. It can catch you. And this has happened. I've seen this a couple years ago even. All right. 90L, here is the buyer's request for seller's consent on the contingent sale. If you're in that situation where you're closing before 30 days or over 45 days, or you got a contingent buyer for your contingent buyer, you got to get seller's permission. This is the form you're going to use. It is the 90L. And this is buyer's request. Buyer requests that seller consent to the following regarding the sale of buyer's property, which purchase and sale agreement is attached to this request. You got to get this signed. Then the seller can sign this consenting. Seller's notice and consent to second contingent sale. There's that one. Or seller's notice of consent pending sale. Seller hereby gives notice of seller's consent to the sale of buyer's property pursuant to the purchase and sale agreement dated the date, which is contingent upon the closing of a pending sale of that second buyer's property. Or seller's notice of consent extending closing. Seller hereby gives notice of seller's consent to the sale of the buyer's property pursuant to the purchase and sale agreement dated whatever, which provides for a closing date more than 45 days from the date of mutual acceptance. For here's the one for more, and here's the one for under. So don't forget, you gotta get and I've had someone actually make this mistake. They signed around that agreement so here's the first contingent, property, that sale for the seller. Here's the buyer's home they gotta sell in order to buy that seller's home, right? Then they're gonna accept a deal that's closing before 30 or over 45 days. They actually signed around that agreement first, and then they had this go along with it. You can't do that. You actually have to get the seller's permission first, then get mutual. So it's a process, and that one could go. I think the most I've ever seen is 4 deals, contingent. So the first buyer is, you know, the very last buyer is not contingent. They're buying this buyer's home, so this buyer can buy this buyer's home, so this buyer can buy this buyer's home, so this buyer can buy this seller's home. That's the most I've ever seen in my career. And it was bonkers. And of course they did it, where there was stuff wrong in all of it.
So it would come down to like that and
It's
seller.
a domino effect.
So like if one seller is like, no,
Yeah,
like 5 or 6 people don't get a house.
yep,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sucks.
yeah, not good. So this is the form you've got to get the permission for, okay? And then the very last one is the seller's notice of consent to adjacent closing. Seller hereby gives notice of seller's consent for buyer to adjust the closing date for the sale of buyer's property to pursuant to the purchase and sale agreement dated such and such. So you can also adjust the closing. That's the 90L. All right, 90LR, this is the notice for Form 22L. And this is that notice of termination. Pursuant to a lease review, buyer's notice of termination, buyer hereby gives notice to seller that the buyer disapproves the lease, rental agreement, or related agreements and or documents set forth in the lease review addendum to the purchase sale agreement, Form 22L, and therefore elects to terminate the agreement and demands a return of the earnest money. So you use this with the 90LR. This is where there's a 22L in a deal, and then you would terminate on that. 90M, notice of termination pursuant to the neighborhood review in the Form 35. If the buyer is going to back out based on the neighborhood review, you would use the 90M. And this is a one-sided form, 90M and a Form 50 to get the earnest money back. 90N is the notice of termination. This is the disapproval of park rules and regs for Form 23. This is for manufactured homes in a park. You would basically use this to terminate. If the buyer reviewed them, they're not happy. What do you mean I can't put a slide on my front porch? Okay, I'm out. Whatever, this is what you would utilize. 90O, notice of termination, unable to assume a lease, Form 23. So in the event that buyer cannot assume the lease, then you would use this to terminate. And this is also for the manufactured home. $90P, this one is definitely something you'd use for the feasibility contingency, right? You got two different notices for the 90P. This is the notice of termination. Feasibility contingency is disapproved for the 35F form. Buyer disapproves the result of the feasibility study of the property and elects to terminate the agreement and demands the return of the earnest money. So you would use the Form 90P and a Form 50. This is the second one. Notice of satisfaction. So feasibility contingency approval. Buyer approves the result of the feasibility study of the property and elects to proceed with the transaction on the terms in the agreement. So that's when they're approving the feasibility study. I told you guys there's a form for that, always, pretty much. 90Q, this is the notice of termination. The public offering statement is disapproved for Form 28. That's a condo purchase and sale agreement. That's where the buyers reviewed the public offering statement and they're terminating based on that review. 90R, notice of termination. The resale certificate is unacceptable. This is a form for a Form 28. Obviously, that's the same thing, the condo. So now this one is they're disapproving the resale certificate and backing out. Okay, 90R is the resale certificate. Oh, no, that's the one we just said. 90S is the seller's notice that title commitment is available. So once they've done the full title commitment, they can send this over. Seller's notice that the title commitment is available. Seller hereby gives notice that the preliminary commitment for title insurance is available for buyer's review pursuant to the title contingency addendum Form 22T. The preliminary commitment for title insurance is attached or available at the offices of the listing agent or available at the offices of the title insurance company designated in this agreement. Here's the order number. Did you know this was even available?
No.
When would you use
And
that?
like,
So you-
why do I bother?
If you
to
have the
attach
listing
it to
up, you didn't have the title.
Yeah.
Uploaded yet,
That's the scenario. If there's no preliminary title in the listing
and you get an
and you
offer,
get an offer and there, in that offer, there's a 90T. You gotta get the preliminary title ordered. Once it's available, you're supposed to be using this and sending it over listing brokers.
Cause it's proof. that-
Because it's proof you did what you said you would do. This does not happen. What happens? What
Here's the
typically
prelim.
happens?
Here's the prelim.
Yeah, here you go, here it is. That, I mean, so this form is, obviously, you know, people probably don't even know this exists. Seriously.
And we're considering it to be delivered though, like an email saying, here's the prelim. Is that just as good? Not as good as, I mean, this is probably the best way. but
That's the
is
best
that
way.
adequate to just,
I mean, that's what happens.
Email
Like,
chain.
I mean,
email and then call them, or text them as well.
or in email to them and then have them say received. Like, is that just?
I
as
mean,
good as
it's typically what we see happen.
Yeah.
Has this ever come up in like an audit where you didn't have this form or?
No. I think that, I mean, it's probably should be. It's definitely something they could say that, hey, we're having an audit. Where's your, looks like there was no preliminary. You accepted that there's a 90T in the deal. Right? You can do it. Realistically, listing brokers should never be lazy and the preliminary title should be ordered as soon as humanly possible. When you're talking with the seller, as soon as you start talking with the seller to list their property, title should be ordered. Preliminary title should be ordered. If that title company is charging you guys for canceling or not even getting the listing or whatever, you better switch to a different company as fast as you can, because that's bull. That there's no way that should be happening this day and age. With all the fraud and the thing that goes on, you know, out there, no way. We can't do our job unless you really do that. So should be done. All right, so 22SS, short sale. This is notice pursuant to the short sale addendum. If you're doing a short sale, this is the notice of lender's consent or notice of no lender consent, or the notice of additional offers, or the notice of termination, or the notice of termination based on buyer. So it's a multi-use form in a short sale. You'll be using the 90SS. 90T is the title contingency notice. So this is the thing for buyer's notice of disapproval of the title exceptions. Buyer gives the notice that they disapprove of the exceptions. Here's the seller's response, and then the buyer's notice of termination if the seller never clears the exceptions. So this goes along with the title contingency also. 90U is buyer's pending sale contingency notice. Here's the failure to close and termination. Buyer hereby gives notice that the pending sale identified in forms buyer's pending sale of property contingency addendum form 22Q has failed or will fail to close. This agreement shall terminate. The earnest money shall be refunded to buyer along with the form 50. Or here's the waiver. Even though the pending sale identified in buyer's pending sale of property contingency addendum form 22Q has not closed, buyer hereby elects to proceed with this agreement, waives the pending sale of the property contingency, and agrees to close the sale as provided in the agreement. Buyer understands that by waiving the pending sale of property contingency, buyer waives all other remaining contingencies, including financing and inspection in the agreement. So it kind of falls along the same line. If you're using a 22Q pending sale, that's not the 22B contingent property. That means you got a deal already under contract. You're making an offer on a seller's property. This is the notice for you know, those situations. All right, 90VV, this is buyer's notice of termination for homeowner's insurance is unavailable. If you guys had that, is it 22VV? Yeah, 22VV goes with the 90VV. 22 VV is like you have the contingency for the buyer to get insurance for the property. If they can't get insurance for the property, it's to their unsatisfactory condition that maybe it's way too high because of flood insurance or something. Then they can walk based on that contingency. We did go over that form just a few, probably a few months back. But here's the notice for termination that the homeowner's insurance is unavailable. Buyer hereby gives notice that after a good faith effort, buyer is unable to obtain a binder for homeowner's insurance on the terms set forth in the homeowner's insurance contingency provision of the agreement. As set forth in the agreement, the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. 90W, here's buyer's notice of termination for homeowners association review. So if you're using the 22D and in that, second page, you're doing the homeowners review contingency and they're going to back out for any reason under the sun in those scenarios, then you're using the 90W and a Form 50 to get the buyer's earnest money back. Maybe they wanted an RV parked on their own property and they wanted to review the HOA docs. You're going to mark 22D page 2 for the HOA review. And then if they find out that you can't do the RV parking on their property, or maybe they want to put a pool, or maybe they want to park their business truck on the property, this is what you would have to do. And this is the way to terminate based on that contingency. Here's the 90X, buyer's notice of termination for the well. Buyer's 90Y is for buyer's termination on the septic addendum. This one can happen for the contingency for septic systems. So if they're going to terminate based on that inspection report for the septic, boom, 90Y and then Form 50, get their earnest money back. 90Z's buyer's notice of termination for the information verification period. Front page of our purchase and sale agreement is what you're terminating on, right? So if you had 10 days by default to verify all the foregoing and every information provided by not only the seller, but even by listing firm, you would actually have to put in the materially inaccurate information. Accordingly, buyer elects to terminate the agreement, demands the return of earnest money. We have actually used this. We had a listing broker had their marketing person just copied the previous flyer from their last listing. They put all the new photos of the new listing. They left information from the previous listing on that flyer. Said the home had AC. Our buyer had no home inspection contingency, but we still had the information verification period intact. We actually gave notice, put in here that property said it had AC. It does not come with AC. Now we verified an inaccurate information provided by the listing broker. And when we called that listing broker, they were pissed. They're like, you guys can't terminate. There's no way you're not terminating on there. And we're like, yeah, we have a right. Here's what we're terminating on. You said the home has AC. She goes, the home doesn't have AC. And I never said that. And it doesn't say that in the listing. Nice try. We supplied this. We actually gave the flyer that they provided to the listing with it. They signed it immediately. She called us and said, this is the first time in history I've ever had a mistake like this, ever. And I'll never make sure, and I'll make sure that every, listing that I review, that the flyers is accurate, because that's a huge lesson. And it worked. We got our buyer out of the deal. But you have to have an actual reason for the materially inaccurate information. Another one that we have gotten out on was the square footage. Square footage was completely wrong.
What if that was by no fault of, say, like the listing agent or seller, it's still remains?
It's still there. It's true. It's inaccurate.
Okay.
All right. 101. This is the tour note. All right, so we're done with the 90s. That's it, you guys. Everything else is pretty much, these are different things for public open house options, agreements. We really don't go through any of these independent contractors agreements, all the other stuff, interplead. This is more internal type of stuff. And then the very last but not least is all of the pamphlets, which we're going to be starting over our entire forms class again. But we will be starting, obviously, with the brand new updated forms with the manuals as soon as we get those upon the release on, August like 16th. So be prepared. We'll be starting over. Thank you guys for making it today. Sorry for the delay. And we will see you guys on the next one. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Eric.
Bye.